And welcome to this week's live, where we're going to continue the topic from last week, which was about microdosing psychedelics for therapeutic and medicinal uses. So, if anyone is tuning into this and didn't tune into last week's, it would be a great idea to look over that because we speak about the history of psychedelic use and which psychedelics are good to use for microdosing, and we compared LSD and psilocybin and how these came about. So I think that's good to check out if you're interested in that. And then this week we're going to speak more about the actual specific protocols. So just to review a bit from last week, microdosing, we spoke about, as I said, both LSD and psilocybin, but we're going to focus on psilocybin for the reason, they're very similar in terms of actually their mechanisms on the brain and their therapeutic use, which we're going to talk about in a bit more detail. But they're quite different in terms of how they're actually created and how they're extracted, and how easily you can actually access them and how easily you can know the quality. Because LSD is made in a laboratory, it's much harder to know the quality and where it comes from, compared to mushrooms, which are fairly easy to grow and source because they, just grow naturally in soil. And the other main point that I like to kind of bring everyone's attention to is this, the use cases. So psilocybin has been used, up to, people think, 10,000 BC, or in some cases, people even argue prior to that, up to even millions of years ago. They've been used in South America, Aztec, and also Central American cultures ceremonially for rituals, for healing and cleansing, and all of these things for a long time. So there's a big historic use of them. And I think that, one of the things that we like to focus on here when we talk about health is the idea of ancestral health and ancestral wisdom. So a lot of the practices like cold exposure and fasting and these kind of health practices that we like to use and celebrate, a lot of them have been used and integrated into traditions, and this kind of proves, quote unquote, their usefulness because they have been continued to be used over time. So, and this is not the case with LSD. So these are kind of some of the main differences between them. So yeah, just to remind everyone that they have been many, and there are many studies being done on the health benefits of psychedelics. And this is a specific systemic study that tracked the experience of 98 microdoses over a 6-week period. And it reduced depression, stress levels, and had some changes in personality traits. So basically, overall, the psychedelics affected mood, creativity, concentration, productivity, and empathy. So I would say the main kind of areas that people see benefits in are improved mental health. So as we said, the stress, anxiety, depression. But then a lot of people also feel enhanced brain function. So there are some people who, for example, people who suffer from ADHD and attention disorders. Some people find that psychedelics really help them focus and have a lot of clarity. Maybe in the same way that taking something like Ritalin would do, but without the negative side effects of that. And the last kind of main area is in reducing the addiction to other habits. So people find that they're able to quell and diminish addiction to, let's say, coffee, alcohol, smoking through the use of psychedelics. And although I would say that larger doses and bigger trips are more useful for that, because they allow you some kind of, I would say, kind of like existential or very, very big life awareness shift. Microdosing is a lot more subtle. I think it still does have an effect on that addiction. So So how does microdosing do this? So basically, it affects the five HT2A receptors. It's basically a serotonin receptor that's concentrated in the brain's prefrontal cortex, but also located in the digestive system. And psychedelics basically stimulate this receptor. And two things that happen when this stimulation occurs is that the production of brain-derived nootropic factors increases, neuron growth, connections, and more activity. And secondly, the transmission of glutamate, which is responsible for cognition, learning, and memory. So that is one of the mechanisms. And the second one is the one that's maybe more commonly known. So which is the default mode network. And the reason why this is more talked about is because this is also the region of the brain that's affected by meditation. So the default mode network is a set of brain regions and pathways that exhibit strong low frequency oscillations during the resting state. And it's thought to be activated when individuals are focused on their internal mental state processing, such as self-referential processing, introspection, autobiographical memory retrieval, and imagining the future. So let's see if I have, oh no, I don't have another. But basically, this is the part, when people talk about psychedelics, they often talk about this idea of ego death. Um, and same with meditation, it can have similar effects. So what psychedelics help us do is kind of down regulate activity in the default mode network, so that as this slide talks about, this is really the internal mental state that self-references, or where it's the region of the brain where we kind of think about ourselves or know ourselves to be ourselves. So our ego, ourself, whatever it is that you want to call it. So when we remove activity and focus from that area, we're able to think in a broader way and in a more abstract way. And I think this is often where a lot of the benefits come from. So to speak specifically about protocols, this is, I would say, the beginners or best protocol to start with. And it's a protocol pioneered by a man called James Fadiman, who is a psychologist and researcher. He's kind of known as the father of microdosing. And has researched the therapeutic use of psychedelics for many years. And he's the one who developed this specific protocol. So the protocol is 1 day of microdosing and 2 days of break, and then you microdose on the fourth day. So the second day is kind of the afterglow day, and then and then you have a regular day, and then you microdose again. And this is repeated for around 1 to 2 months, and then you take a break for 2 to 4 weeks, around half a month to a month, and then you begin again. And yeah, if anyone wants to kind of begin, this is the best protocol to begin with, because um, it's quite low dose. So on the next slide, I talk about the dosage. So basically, the dose is 0.1 to 0.3 grams. And in order to actually measure the dose, you're going to need a micro scale, which I show later on in the presentation. You can't just use a normal cooking scale, because they usually only measure 1 gram and up. So it really has to be a micro. And the idea is that microdosing is supposed to be sub-perceptible. So what that means is, on the day that you start, you don't really notice any effects. It's more that the effects are compounded in the brain over time. So if you really feel a big shift in energy, or you feel sleepy, or you feel overstimulated, then it's likely that you took too high of a dose, and it's better to reduce and start slower and then build up from there. Um, and the best thing to do is take it in the morning, because usually it does affect focus, and you don't really want to be focused at night. It might affect the sleep quality, basically, if you take it in the evening. So this is one protocol that's really well known. And the second one is the Stamets stack. So you might have heard of Paul Stamets from his My Community, which is his supplement brand. He has lion's mane and reishi and chaga and all the different adaptogenic mushrooms. And he also has a couple of documentaries. I think Fantastic Fungi is one where he features a lot. So he's basically a self-taught mycologist and entrepreneur that's really well known for his work with mushrooms. He's featured on the Joe Rogan podcast many times. And he's won many different awards basically for his work with mycology. So in his protocol, it's called the Stamets stack, because you basically stack lion's mane and niacin along with along with the psilocybin. And lion's mane is basically a functional mushroom, so it's an adaptogenic, non-psychedelic mushroom that's also known for neurogenic benefits. So it promotes nerve growth, it improves cognitive function, memory, mood, focus, sleep quality. It has lots of neuroregenerative qualities and is even shown promise in reversing neurological damage. So, generally people who have brain fog or neurological issues, even in the context of long COVID, could benefit from lion's mane. And then the second substance that he stacks the mushrooms with is niacin. So niacin is vitamin B3, and it's basically essential for synthesizing coenzymes critical for various biochemical reactions in the body. It supports energy production, acts as an antioxidant for the skin, muscles, nerves, and DNA regeneration. And niacin is also what's known as a vasodilator. So basically, it dilates blood vessels, and this enhances blood flow to the brain. So this is really the feature of niacin that is particularly interesting in the context of microdosing, because essentially it allows more blood to flow into the brain. So on the days that you're microdosing, you get the psilocybin having this effect on the H2A receptors and serotonin. You have enhanced blood flow to the region through this vasodilation, and you also have the neuroregenerative qualities that lion's mane has to offer as an adaptogenic mushroom. So all of those things stacked on top of one another really have a much stronger effect than just the microdosing alone. And the other thing is that the actual protocol itself is quite different. So it's 4 days of microdosing in a row, and then 3 days of break, where you only take the lion's mane, the adaptogenic mushroom, and you do this for 1 month maximum, and then you take a month, 2 to 4 weeks off. So that's quite different to the other one, where on the other one we spoke about taking it on 1 day, taking 2 days break, and then on the third day taking a second dose. So this one is a much more intense, because you're taking it for 4 days in a row. And the other thing is that it's a lot higher dose. So it's 0.5 to 1 gram. And then 50 to 200 milligrams of mushrooms, and then you wait 20 minutes, and then you take the niacin. So again, I think the most important thing to note on this protocol is that it's really for advanced users and not beginners, because 0.5 to 1 gram is actually quite a high dose of psilocybin. I mean, up to 1 gram, it's for some people, they're borderline having a kind of psychedelic trip, which is not what you want, and also not not the point of microdosing, which is supposed to be kind of sub-perceptible. So yeah, this is, although of course, I mean, these are general protocols, and of course it's possible to tailor them to some extent. So, you could always do the lion's mane and the niacin, and then just have a lower dose of psilocybin. So let's say 0.3 grams, as opposed to this higher dose. And the same with the Fadiman protocol. It can be that you do 0.1 on a day when you have to, focus a lot at work, and you want to make sure that your state of perception is not altered in some kind of way. But then on the weekend, if you're going to see a museum or to the cinema, for example, you could go up to 0.25, and maybe that would be more of like a sensorial experience, but it would be heightened in that way. But and it might be difficult to say work on an Excel sheet if you're in that state. It wouldn't really be helping to optimize that. So it's really possible to kind of tailor your experience, and this happens within very small dosages, and this is why it's important to get the micro scale, because the difference between zero point 0.2 and zero point 0.4 is really massive, even though it's zero point 0.2 of a gram. Um, so that is important. And then, so the other thing about the niacin flush, the niacin, is that it causes what's called as the niacin flush for many people. And this is because it's a vasodilator, so it's expanding the blood vessels. So the capillaries expand, increase blood flow to the skin surface. And then what happens is that around the neck and the face and the chest, you can get this redness. And I guess you can almost feel like this tingling sensation around, and it's totally harmless and it passes, but it's just the result of the vasodilation. So that is also something to keep in mind for this protocol. So how to do the microdosing? So basically, once the mushrooms are dehydrated, usually, people usually buy, or let's say in the case of buying them, and later on we're going to talk about growing them. It's important to grind them in a spice grinder or a coffee grinder, and this is because the mushroom cap, it's called the fruiting body, so that has a lot more psilocybin concentrated than the stem. So it's taking 0.2 grams of stem is totally different to the fruiting body in terms of the concentration of psilocybin. So it's important to grind them into a powder so that you get a more even consistency, basically, of psilocybin. And what some people do is buy cellulose capsules, that supplements are in, and they insert the ground mushrooms into the capsules. Um, Another way to do it is adding them to tea or water and drinking it like that. Personally, I prefer to just keep the powder and then measure it in, on the day, and have a very small little spoon that you, or a thin knife that you use to scoop and measure, and then just have it straight away without the capsules. And the reason for that is because just avoiding the extra thing of having a capsule. But the other thing is related to what I said, where it's possible to kind of experiment with the dose once you're kind of used to the protocol. And it might be that you realize that zero point 0.2 is your optimal dose for working, but 0.3 is great for going to the park on the weekend or doing something. And in that way, you can, just experiment a little bit more with the doses. Whereas if you pre-weigh and package them all, then there's not really that much space for that. But even if you are experimenting with the dose, it's a good idea to stick to the actual protocol. Whichever protocol you choose, to stick to it, and then take the break when it's time to take a break after 1 month or 2 months, depending on which one you do, just to give your body and brain a chance to integrate. So journaling, this is also a really great and necessary thing to do along the journey, because how you feel at the beginning is likely to be different to how you feel after 1 month of microdosing, for example. And I would say what commonly people experience is I mean, we spoke generically about anxiety and depression and all these kind of things. But I would say, to be more specific about it, if anyone has had an experience of meditating, one of the images that people use when it comes to meditation is this idea of waves or thoughts that pass us, but we don't get involved in them so deeply. So imagine a wave, you're on the sea, and a wave kind of comes and it just washes over you. This is how thoughts can be this is analogous to how a thought or a feeling kind of enters your field of awareness, and then it kind of just leaves like a wave passing by. But when we get anxiety, what happens is that the thought wave enters, and then we become very involved in that thought wave. We start thinking, oh, what if this happens, and what if that, and what if I should do this, or maybe that, or I don't know, and worst case scenario. And basically, what happens when we do that is that we're getting sucked into the wave, and we're traveling with the wave itself instead of just letting it go over us. And in meditation, there are a lot of techniques. You imagine yourself distant from the thoughts themselves. You imagine yourself separate. You don't identify with thoughts. You have visualizations like what I'm saying about the waves. You have things that help you recenter with the breath. There are all these techniques. But with the microdosing, what I find is that it somehow enables you to embody this quality more strongly. So, something will happen that would normally make you feel really overwhelmed and anxious, but it just kind of goes past you like a wave, just washes over you, and you just feel surprised that, oh wow, I kind of just moved on with my day, and I didn't really feel so involved in those thoughts, and I didn't get stuck in the whirlwind of them and overthinking and analyzing. So that is one more concrete thing, and I would say the other thing is just a heightened sense of gratitude and a heightened sense of really enjoying life. So maybe activities that you normally do, you have even greater sense of enjoyment from. You really appreciate the natural world. You really appreciate friendships and maybe family members. Um, Maybe a sense of gratitude when you're hanging out with your partner or your friends. So all of these positive emotions are kind of amplified and felt more strongly. And then, as I said, the negative things, they arise, but then they kind of wash over very quickly. So this is one kind of more tangible way to describe it, I would say. So this is a note on the legality. So despite the success of decriminalization movements, so I'm sure if anyone is kind of following psychedelics in the news, you'll see there are so many studies that get released every couple of weeks, and many states kind of decriminalize at different times. Um, However, it's still illegal to buy or sell them in most places of the world, including the US. However, the spores, so that the spores are what you grow the mushrooms with, they basically don't contain psilocybin, because it's only once the mushrooms actually grow that they have psilocybin in them. So those spores can be obtained legally in most Western countries and in the US, except for California, Georgia, and Idaho. So those are the only states which have a ban on the actual selling of the spores. But in every other state, you can buy spores, and it's legal to do that. However, there's the caveat of germinating the spores, which is kind of ironic, because what's the point of buying them if you're not going to germinate them? But this is the thing with drug regulation, it often doesn't really make sense. And I think that the steps to legalization, it takes quite a while. And I'm sure, I mean, many of you are familiar with the process of legalization of marijuana, for example. And there are these laws about owning it or having it, but then selling it is different, and then growing it is different. So there are all these kind of loopholes and different ways in which it's legal and not legal. So germinating the spores is considered cultivation, which is a violation of the US Controlled Substances Act. And this is why most professional vendors indicate in their documentation that the spores should not be germinated, and that they're for educational purposes only. And if you write to them and ask questions about cultivation, they usually won't reply. So that is something to bear in mind if you decide to cultivate your own. And so Third Wave, this website, Third Wave, is actually a really, really good resource when it comes to everything to do with psychedelics. They have protocols, they have the history of, they have sourcing guides, they have growing guides, they have really great, you know, they have they provide links to different companies that will sell the spores and the pros and cons of growing. Because growing is, I mean, if any of you have actually done something like fermentation, wild fermentation, or sourdough bread making or kombucha, all of these kind of things are quite nuanced, and you can think of growing mushrooms almost a bit like gardening, right? They're not super easy to grow because they need to grow in a temperature around room temperature. So it's difficult to grow them in winter. You need to have some kind of heating pad that sits under them to help them stay warm. You need to make sure they don't get moldy because they're really predisposed to mold. So often they're kind of contained in like a plastic bag, and you have to spray them with water every couple of days, and usually wear a mask when you're doing that so you don't contaminate. So the process can be a little bit involved. But it's a lot more economical to do that than to um, buy them, because usually the price is around $10 per gram, which is quite expensive. And obviously, growing your own and buying a spore kit is a lot less expensive, and you should get around 13 to 100 grams in every kit. Um, and then, of course, you need to go through the process of dehydration, and you need a good dehydrator to really make sure that all the moisture is out so that they are preserved. And then once they are, you can keep them in the fridge for up to a year, and they won't go moldy. Um, so yeah, I think when it comes to, if anyone's interested, I can send this guide to sourcing. I think that it's still a bit taboo to talk about that because of the legalization of it, but you can find all the information there, and the caveat of the spores versus actually buying mushrooms, because the spores themselves are legal. So great. I think that is it. We're almost at the 30-minute mark. I'm going to check if there are any questions. Okay, so can people with anxiety do mushrooms? So yes, as I said, my mushrooms help a lot with anxiety and depression, and all of the studies that have been done on them so far show that they are really great for that. And this is because of this, how they affect serotonin receptors, but also how they downregulate the activity in the default mode network. So your sense of self, your sense of, because anxiety, it's often driven by, sometimes it's driven by self-consciousness, let's say. So you're thinking about, what does this person think of me? What do these people think of me? Do I appear this or that? Or, if it's in the case of social anxiety, let's say, in the case of a party or something, or even in a work setting, when you're concerned what people think, and that spirals into anxiety, because the mushrooms are turning down the activity in the part of the brain where we identify with ourselves, then that enables us to turn down the volume on anxiety itself, because you're less in this part of your brain that basically you self-identify with, which I know is quite a difficult concept to get your head around. And I think that for people who do meditation a lot and mindfulness, there's this sense of really knowing that you are not your thoughts. And when a thought enters your brain, um, you don't have to identify so much with the thought, because you're an entity that exists in behind that thought, let's say. And this is why it's really great to do psychedelics along with mindfulness and along with meditation practices, because they're all kind of cultivating the same sense of awareness. Um, so have psychedelics ever raised anyone's IQ? I don't know about that. That's a good question. I guess IQ is a very narrow measure of intelligence. And I would say that if the psychedelics would help someone focus on an IQ test, for example, it will help you stay focused and not be distracted, then perhaps it could, just by that medium. Um, but yeah, I mean, it's difficult because we'd have to really talk about to answer that. We'd have to really talk about what are all the different features that um, kind of feed into an IQ test, like what kind of reasoning and what kind of speed of reasoning is necessary to say that you have a higher IQ, and if mushrooms actually help to facilitate those better. Um, so I don't think, as far as I know, no studies have really been done on that. Which psychedelics make someone more social? I mean, I think that microdosing in general, I mean, definitely taking large doses of psychedelics doesn't necessarily make you more social. Well, definitely not at the time of taking them, right? Because you're just in another universe. But the microdosing, let's say LSD and psilocybin, because those are the two more commonly microdosed psychedelics, they definitely make people more social, I would say in general, but by default of reducing these things that we're talking about. So if you have less anxiety and you have less depression and you have less stress, then you're likely to be more social, right? Because usually the reasons why people avoid social interactions and isolate themselves is because it's driven by um, these mental health kind of considerations. So if you're able to kind of turn the volume down on anxiety and depression and instability and stress, then you're probably more predisposed to be social. Um, so great, thank you, Brian. He said this was great. Um, I missed the beginning. Did you talk about long COVID and POTS? Um, Yes. So yeah, actually, I think we spoke a little bit about long COVID in the first episode, which was last week, and so a lot of people from long COVID suffer from anxiety and depression, and this can be neurologically driven, in the sense of nervous system dysregulation, and neurologically driven anxiety, or it can also be by default of just being ill for so long, right? This is really depressing, like having a chronic condition that lasts for years, that maybe isolates you from friends and family, that maybe makes you feel almost gaslit by people around you, because people don't understand how you could possibly be sick still after all this time. There is the physical component and then the environmental component of it that can drive anxiety and depression. And for sure, microdosing can help to alleviate that anxiety, that type, I mean, both of those types of anxiety and depression. So, and, as far as all the studies show, there are no side effects of this. So it's not the kind of thing where it's like a pharmaceutical drug where there's this really long list of side effects and you just have no idea how this will affect you. And I know this feels, because psychedelics are still a taboo, I think that people feel really hesitant because they feel like they're doing something really crazy to their brain that might have long-term effects. But it's interesting to think that something like drinking coffee is really normalized and drinking alcohol is really normalized, and the effect of these two very everyday normal substances is much, much, much stronger than taking a microdose, for example. Taking a microdose, you unless you're very perceptive, you won't even really notice that something happened. Whereas, at least for me, if I have a coffee, it's very obvious and strong. I can feel shaky and nauseous, and I feel like very obviously more awake. And same with having a glass of wine; it's a very obvious shift in perception. Um, so it's interesting to kind of just reframe and ask yourself why substances that are legal and everyday, even though they cause such a shift in our perception, are kind of normalized and accepted. And then things like psychedelics, which taken in small doses are actually less intense. but they're just more taboo because, well, I mean, there's a long history about why, and I could do another whole talk just on the criminalization of psychedelics and how before the I think it was 1970s or late 1960s when they became prohibited, but before that they were actually quite widely used in the psychology realm, and many psychologists would use them therapeutically. So yeah, that's a good deep dive to go down, on the history of psychedelic prohibition and what was actually driving that, because it's quite dubious and sketchy, I would say, that what was driving that, considering they're such a useful substance that don't have side effects that can really be used to help people. So, um, so yeah, basically, I think it can be an interesting and useful tool for long COVID. Is there a strain that you recommend? So there are around 180 strains of psilocybin mushrooms. So there's really a lot. And I would say that Golden Teacher are the good ones to start with, because they are less strong and more mellow, and they're more common. So yeah, I think Golden Teacher, that's a good one to start with. But again, in this guide, if anyone is interested in the third wave guide to sourcing psychedelics, they list a lot of different species, and which are, because some are more hallucinogenic, some make people feel more creative, some people make more people feel more focused. There are just many different ones, and some are extremely strong. So of course, if you're starting, you want to avoid the ones that are really strong and go with a more mellow one, like the Golden Teacher. So I think that's it. Um, yeah, I think that's it in terms of questions. Um, yeah, so probably, I don't know if we will actually integrate this into um, the Phoenix protocol for long COVID recovery, because it's just not really well, the intersection is not well researched, and you know I think that the protocol that we have so far is working and helping people, but I really wanted to bring people's awareness to this, because I think that for these symptoms like the anxiety, depression, stress, I think it's a really great and useful tool to be aware of. And it can be quite life changing for many people. And also for addiction. We brushed over that quite briefly in the first one and also in this one. But in terms of addiction, and I know that there are a group of people who are also interested in addiction, who follow Dr. Hyder. So in terms of that, it's also a useful tool. So yeah, thank you for listening, everyone who joined. And if anyone has more comments, they can comment on the Facebook page, and then I'll just reply in the next couple of days and reply to the questions. And you can also email me directly at michelle@mygotodoc if you would like to ask any more direct questions, or if you would like to see the PDF about sourcing. So you can scan the code here about the upcoming cohort, which starts on April the 1st. And yeah, otherwise I will see you next week for the next live. Thank you very much, everyone. Bye-bye.